Hello and welcome to another Tyrrell's Classic Workshop. We're going to look at different jobs today here in the workshop and see where they're up to. We've got some new cars in. We're further along with some other projects, so it's a sort of round robin of catching up with various things. The first car I want to talk about today is this machine. This is a 1969 Mercedes 300 SEL 6.3. Mercedes came out with the S-Class. This is the very first S-Class model, or Sonderklasse, or Superclass, or whatever you want to call it, which of course they still have to this day. It's their top of the range, apart from the Maybach brand. And this car was a very safe. It's the model before it, the Fintail, was the first car to have a passenger safety cell, a strong cell around the cabin, and this carried that over. And Mercedes was obviously still at the cutting edge of technology, which is one of their sort of hallmarks, really. But the car was very boring in a lot of ways, quite ordinary, really, dare I say it. A little too similar to their sort of taxis that they were selling alongside it. But a chap called Eric Waxenberger, who was very senior in Mercedes, decided to just do a bit of mischief one day. And having the whole of the resources of the experimental department sort of at his fingertips, what he did was he took an engine from the big Mercedes, the Grosser Mercedes as it was called, the 600, which was a statement by Mercedes that they could make the best car in the world. It was more expensive than a Rolls-Royce Silver Shadow in the late 1960s. But that's not this car. They took the engine from the 600, which was a 6.3 litre, and that's significant. What Eric Waxenberger did was to quietly, almost secretly, transplant that big engine into this body. And that car, he sort of rather mischievously left it outside the Mercedes management offices one day and gave the key to one or two crucial people without saying anything to them. And he said, "This is a new experimental car, please try it." And they drove home in it, and of course very quickly realized that the performance was out of this world compared to a normal S-Class Mercedes. Cut a long story short, the idea stuck. And here we are with the 300 SEL 6.3, a great big 6.3 litre fuel-injected overhead camshaft lump. And what became of that? This child that was born out of that sort of bringing together of two different things turned out to be one of the fastest, if not the fastest, production saloon of its day. I mean, the figures for a big, heavy car in the late 1960s are almost off the chart, really. 0 to 60 in 6.5 seconds, top speed of just under 140 miles an hour. I mean, they were incredible figures for a four-door saloon, really. Arguably, the Iso Fidia, the Italian four-door saloon, and others could beat it because they had big American V8s, but I'm not sure in the real world whether they'd have been able to do that or not. But the astounding thing about this car is the acceleration. It is absolutely amazing. I've heard stories over the years about Carroll Shelby having races in these along the Strip in Las Vegas against American muscle cars. He happened to have access to either one of these or a 600 at any time through Mercedes-Benz of the USA, and he would go drag racing with them. But what was it that made this car so very fast? Because the acceleration, the in-gear acceleration of this car is still impressive today. It really is almost neck-snapping. It's almost like an electric car, it's instant. And what is the reason for that? Well, it's all to do with something called the fueling curve. Modern cars these days with very sophisticated engine management systems have very precisely metered fuel for the amount of air that's going into them. And petrol engines in particular are extremely fussy about the mixture between air and petrol. It has to be exactly the right mixture for them to work properly. And diesel engines were far less fussy about things like that, and they still are. As long as you throw a chunk of diesel in a cylinder and it's sort of doing the right thing at the right time, it'll explode and you'll get a bang, you'll get some power out of it. Petrol's far more fussy. This is a fuel injection pump that I had on the shelf, and it is out of this. There's only one other car it was fitted to. That was the Aston Martin DBS V8, the very, very first V8 Aston Martins from sort of 1969-ish. And this pump is a Bosch mechanical injection pump. It's called a plunger pump, and it was originally a diesel pump. As I said, diesel engines within reason, as long as you give them a shot of diesel, they'll work. Petrol is far more fussy, so the transformation from diesel to petrol was not as easy as you might think it is. And one of the first engines to use this mechanical injection pump, which was spawned from a diesel pump, was the Daimler-Benz 600 series, as they were called. They were a V12, so this is an 8 plunger pump. It's got 8 outlets because it's a V8 engine. They had 6, and they had 2 of these on their V12 aero engines. And this particular fuel injection system was first used on the ME-109 fighters in the Battle of Britain. That sort of lead up to that. The Heinkel HE-111 used the same inverted V12s. So in the 1930s, the Germans had these powering their aircraft engines in the war, or a slightly simplified version of this, but not much. And this pump here, this is a petrol one. The diesel one is very similar. It's called a plunger pump. You've got a shaft running through it here, which is driven by this from the engine, and it basically pushes plungers up and down inside as it rotates. And that determines, through this thing here called a rack, which slides alongside and rotates the plungers, that determines how much petrol is injected into the engine. And this pump here, if I tell you it weighs 10 kilos, and the amount of effort car manufacturers go to today to shave 10 kilos off anything, they will spend millions doing it. Mercedes-Benz had no alternative but to use this. And they used it with great success. But the thing is, it's sort of a blunt instrument. They like running a bit rich, they like over-fueling a bit. And that's why when you snap open the throttle on this car, it's not like a modern car where everything is micromanaged in terms of the amount of fuel going into the cylinder. And the engine management system has to spend however many microseconds catching up with itself when you put the accelerator down. On this, it just opens all the taps up and off she flies. That's why the acceleration is so instantaneous. And just one last thing on this. When Mercedes launched the W140, as it was called, the S-Class in 1989, the big boxy one, they introduced their first production V12 engine. And that, when it first came out, developed 408 brake horsepower. The later versions of that engine, because Mercedes wanted to wind back they were prepared to sacrifice a bit of throttle response for drivability and fuel economy. The later ones developed 392 brake horsepower because they got rid of the enrichment. So what I'm going to do is we've been doing a little bit of work on final detailing and setting up. We can't take the credit for this beautiful restoration. This was done by a gentleman called Doug Burton, who lives in the UK but is from Zimbabwe originally, and he did a lovely job of the car. But what we are doing is just doing a bit of fine tuning, and I'm going to road test the car and make sure it's okay. Well, we've done our little adjustments on the fuel injection system, and I'm just going to give her a run, and we'll see if we can replicate the sort of instantaneous throttle response that I'm talking about. The reason I mentioned before that 6.3 was significant is that Mercedes regarded this car as so important in their history. It was also one of the first cars that spawned the AMG connection with Mercedes when they went racing with these. The 6.3 was so important to them that I believe that's why lots of AMG current models still use the 6.3 engine size, that Mercedes have arrived at that for sort of the emotional impact of this car when it was new and the effect it had. Because if people wanted a sort of very expensive, very uncompromising express saloon car around the turn of the 60s, 70s, this was it. And sort of pop stars, celebrities, all queued up to buy 300 SEL 6.3s. It was quite a game changer, and it really did put Mercedes on the map in a whole new way. The car that followed, the 450 SEL 6.9, was a car very much in a similar vein, but this was the one that really started it. So we've warmed the engine up now. I'm just going to get into a position where we can open the taps a little bit. Of course, there is a price to pay with a fuel injection system that basically gives the engine what it wants, and that is fuel consumption. These cars, it's a very different world to what it was in 1970. We thought of an economical car then as doing maybe 25 miles to the gallon. Now that would be considered heresy to most people, let alone the electric car users. But I imagine, I can't say I've proved this, but I imagine if you really tried, you could get one of these down to single figures in terms of miles per gallon. Not great, but that was the world back then. Fuel was dirt cheap. It was before the oil crisis of 1972, 1973, 74. Petrol was, or gasoline was still very, very cheap. Yeah, she's responding really nicely now. I think we've got a result here. Here we go. Hopefully that was pretty instantaneous throttle response. Hopefully that communicated in some way. I'll just do that again while we've got it straight. That's what you call throttle response. And sort of modern turbocharged, eco-boosted, whatever the whizzy names that they call them are, you just will not get throttle response like that. So this car still thrills even now. It's still amazing to drive. It's a real wolf in sheep's clothing. People would look at this car and never think that it was capable of performance like that. So I think that's a tick. I think we have a good result here. We're in good shape. I'm very happy with that. Another car that we're going to talk about today is the yellow Lamborghini Miura, which looks a little different to the last time we looked at it. It's got no suspension on now. It's completely stripped down to its bare body. So let's take a look at the steps that we're going to be taking next with this. Well, this is the floor of the Miura. As I mentioned in a previous video when we were looking at the design of the Miura body, it is a monocoque, it is a one-off unit, there's no separate chassis frame, but it is made up of lots of sort of pressed sections for ease of manufacture, low volume manufacture comparatively in the 60s. They had these swaging marks on from new, so this is more than likely the original factory floor. These rather interesting vents were also factory original. They scooped up air underneath the car. Very primitive form of trying to keep the cabin cool, but it worked. Up into vents that were sort of by your elbow in the center console. And really, it was to say, it was once you were on the move, it was very, very good. This area here has been replaced. It's been reworked, because this is the original swaging that Mercedes used. We've got tooling to replicate that. But this is not original, because that would have had the swaging ribs in it as well. So we're going to cut this section out of the floor and have a look-see, because there is some rust in here as well. But the basic body is generally in very, very good condition. It's had a patch welded on here, which is not original. But we're going to scrape all the underseal off this and make sure that what's underneath is sound or not sound, and then we'll send the whole body away to be blasted. We were going to try and save the yellow paint if we could, that was the plan, but on further analysis, when we've really inspected it very, very thoroughly, there's a lot of paintwork that is not factory, and it's just slightly different colours and hues here and there. So in consultation with the owner, he is most exact that he wants the car repainted, and I have to say, even though I'm a stickler for originality, I agree with him. So this is all going to bare metal, and we will literally start from scratch to build this up. I'm now going to go over to the trim department and see what Craig's been up to.